Just slept for 10 hours. Um, it's almost 6 o'clock. Well, and almost 10 hours. Um, maybe more like 9, but still, that's a long sleep for me. That's not an I'm tired sleep, that's an I'm depressed sleep. Even so, like, even as it is, I'm not exactly keen about waking up. Um, the temperature has come up substantially, although not quite to freezing. Um, I'm hoping we don't get too much snow tomorrow. Because tomorrow I'm heading to see Disappears um, it's at PJ's up in Michigan. That's the first time I'm taking the camera out to the punk strip up in Michigan. Um, I call it the punk strip. It's really more of like a hipster strip, but um, it's the strip where I'm most likely to see a punk-like band. Um, whereas, if I'm looking for a more of a doomy kind of a thing, it's more up at the Magic Stick, which is maybe not the way that anybody wants things, but somebody came in and bought that bar, so that's how things are. I mean, most people would expect the punkier or alternative quote unquote acts to play the Magic Stick, but they don't do that anymore. So they've moved over to the hipster district, um, and the heavier ones have moved out to Ferndale mostly. It's in flux, and nobody really wants to own the demographics that they're picking up, right? So you've seen the Ferndale bar wants to bring in more hipster acts, and the hipster strip wants to assert itself as hipster, and the Magic Stick is still picking up the odd band, so it's confused. Everything's all screwed up and messed up, because nobody really is clear on what their target is at this point. It doesn't help that young people, the tastes of people that are in their early 20s is, as is probably the case for a lot of people that get past a certain age, seems really, really bad. The difference is that I'm actually right. It's very hard to listen to these like fifth generation emo bands and play anything of value out of it. It's all just crap. It's to the point where they're like trying to mix sex appeal with aggro, and the result is this like, when it gets aggro, there's just no thought to it, and it when they go sex appeal, there's just no thought to it, and it's what's missing is thought. And that was never, as the music changed, as the styles evolved, as this or that came out of it, there was always thought in whatever kind of music was dominant and popular. That doesn't seem to be true anymore. And that's a broad social truth, is that the idea of thought seems to have been, well, as I was going through and clearing off my page, something that came up was a Zappa interview where he argued that rational thought was phased out during the Reagan administration. Very true, and in a real sense, we're dealing with the consequence of that now. The last holdovers of rational thought, or any even irrational thought is valuable as long as it's thought. The last holdovers of that idea seems to have peaked in the very early 2000s. Late 90s, early 2000s was kind of like the last gasp. And I mean, those bands still exist. Those bands still create records, but there's very little that's been out for some time that incorporates thought. And so when you're looking for new music, you're not looking for thought. You're looking more for kind of aesthetics, which is frustrating, but is what exists, right? Probably the closest thing to thought that exists in music nowadays is in the reaches of pretentious metal, And I mean, when I say passes for thought, I mean that I'm not sure I would call it thought. Although relatively speaking, it seems more thoughtful. But the music's terrible. So the one almost thoughtful form has just descended into just utter oral ass. Um, there's nothing you can do with a form when you've got somebody screaming through distortion, trying to sound scary or manly or whatever it is that they're trying to sound. It's just, and then you can't figure out what they're saying anyway, so you've got to read it. It may be the only thing that has a remnant of thought left in it, but you can't actually experience it when you're listening to it. And oftentimes it's not good thought. That's the other thing. It might have some concept of thought, but they're bad thoughts. And when I say bad thoughts, I mean bad thoughts in the same way that Rush was perhaps thoughtful, but was bad in its thoughtfulness. Anyways, I've been sufficiently silly here for a little while. That's generated some content that nobody's going to care about because I don't have a picture of my hair up. And I think that's the reason I slept, because I was feeling a little bit frustrated with existence this morning. I probably could have stayed up a lot longer. This is about the right time to wake up at, but I went to bed a little early because I was just not happy with you people and your shallow thinking. I had to lie down. How far did I get? I got to the end of 2014, so I'm starting at the beginning of 2015. There's less posts, I think, from this point on. Or at least there will be once I get over kind of a flurry of activity. That started at the beginning of January, and it was mostly related to doing record reviews for the previous year. And that was actually a quitting smoking project as well. Although this time I'm over it. I'm over 5 weeks. So this is legit. This is the longest I've ever gone. Seriously. Like cold turkey. I've gone this long without buying packs, but I've never gone this long cold turkey. And I do think that once I get some air tomorrow, my demeanor will be a little bit different. It'll be nice to just kind of relax and have a beer or two. I haven't done that in a while. I think that's maybe partly why I'm a little bit verklempt. I've just been cooped up for too long, so that'll be good. But yeah, that's I'm waking up a little bit irritated with existence and with people, and hopefully that sorts itself out. It seems like this is going to be probably a long day. This is probably a 2-day. I don't know how I work in sleep before the show, so presuming I go, this is the beginning of a longer day. So I just watched another one of these Caspian reports. This is the same person as the Russian. The way I have my watch later list set up is that I put all the stuff from the second half of 2014 in the list, but I had to add it on a source-by-source basis. So Caspian means I've made it up to C. Means I've got a while to go, but it means I'm going to be watching all the rest of the stuff that this channel put up for 2014. And I suppose when I'm done, I might not be done until the end of 2016 sort of thing, so I might have to go through 2 years of stuff to add up through the next one kind of thing. So this is what happens when you have a huge list of stuff. But anyways, so I'm watching this.
I should point out that I'm actually familiar with this person. His name is Mir Shivan. He's an Israeli economist. I'm familiar with him because he's done a lot of work with the Real News Network, which is something that Paul Jay put together when he was pushed out of the CBC by the Conservative government in Canada. And I'm not sure that Paul Jay would even say that much, but I mean it's clear as day, right? Anyways, this report is sharing a bit of a parallel with the Russian report in that it seems to be very heavily tilted towards an American intelligence perspective of things. He's basically presenting the idea that Saudi Arabia would open up under the king's direction if it wasn't for the religious conservatives that are pulling them back. Um, and I certainly think that he's explaining a dynamic correctly, but he didn't at all even begin to discuss the pressure that might exist from the outside. He tried to present it entirely as an internal debate where you have the monarchy pushing for modernization and the religious bodies pushing for stagnancy. The reality is that Saudi Arabia is an authoritarian state. The king has the final say in everything. If he wanted to, he could, let some heads roll kind of thing, and those bodies would essentially do what he says. The idea that this conflict exists is itself kind of a mirage. Um, that's just not how authoritarian states operate. Um, it's kind of an error of, you live in a democracy. You look at how you see the world, and you want to apply your perception of things to everybody else. And I know I've seen enough from Cher to conclude that he's very conscious of growing up in Israel and being relatively young, and he's I think he's in his 20s, although he might be in his 30s now, um, or he might not be though. And being relatively young, growing up in a society like Israel, you have to realize that you are bombarded with messages about how the Muslims and the Arabs are inferior to you. And I mean, growing up in the West here, in North America, we get a little bit of that, and it's getting worse, and everybody can see that, but it's nothing like Israel. Israel is a society based on a racial class divide, and that needs to be enforced, and it needs to be enforced through constant media bombardment. And if you're smart enough, you can see that, you can deconstruct it, but you're constantly on guard against it. So you're constantly trying to find ways to to disentangle it, to throw it off, and to see the people that you're told are inferior as equals, and you're constantly mentally adjusting, and all these sorts of things. And what I've picked up from Scheer is that he's in the process of doing that. He's picked up a lot of theory from the American pseudo left. In fact, they're American conservatives. Although they call themselves leftists, the media calls them leftists, and there's all this confusion about that. But I mean, it's their ideas are very right wing, and their entire perception of things is very right wing. And in the process, what they've done is they've projected themselves onto a different culture without recognizing that this is a different culture. They do have cultural differences. They're not the same. And their system isn't interchangeable with the system that you know. Um, he called the body the Saudi Arabian Parliament. Um, it's if you want to call it that. The comparison is so weak as to probably not even really want to bother. It's more like an advisory council. That's the correct monarchist way to look at it, right? So you have the king, and then you have the king's advisors, and the king appoints his advisors, but the king makes the decisions. And it's the same thing with these bodies, right? Um, when you look at the better way to understand things from my perspective, I'm speaking from a mostly European descended North American perspective, and the way I'm seeing it, the way I would interpret it, would be to look at the conflict between the king and the church in Europe in the Middle Ages, and the king always won um, because ultimately the king had power and the king made those choices, right? Um, Now it is different because there's not like in Saudi Arabia the king and the caliph are actually the same thing. Um, it, they don't technically have a caliph, but for all intents and purposes, the Saudi king is the caliph, right? So it's even providing too much power to these religious bodies. What I'm getting at is that the conflict that he's describing is no doubt real, but the dynamics that he's constructing are um, created out of a desire for somebody to reverse their racist programming and see the other as themselves, which is itself um, blinded, let us say. I don't want to throw around insults that are not coming from any place of intent. So the Saudi system is different. So what's actually going on? Well, there's all this pressure coming in from the outside, right? And so the Saudi prince or the Saudi king, I'm sorry, he's the king. He makes it. It might look like the Saudi king is pushing reforms and is the moderate and all these sorts of things, but what he's really doing is he is carrying out policy directives from the hegemonic power in the region, which is the United States, which is trying to make changes to the society to, well, first of all, so that perceptions of Saudi society are changed in the United States, which is of great importance. If you're outside of North America, you might not realize how important that is, but it is of great importance that the Saudi Arabian reputation is modified to allow for continued alliance. I mean, all you have to do is look at Donald Trump's, uh, you know, ranting in the election campaign. Trump might not be the establishment, and he might not be reflecting establishment perspectives, but he is reflecting populist perceptions. And if you're the establishment and you recognize the importance of the alliance with the Saudis, you realize that those populist perceptions need to change. And so there's all this pressure coming in from the outside to push things down. The king is the agent of that, of course. But why is it not changing? Because, of course, the king does not actually want it to change. If he did, he would just put it through a decree, snap his fingers, and it would be done. But that entire um, uh, dynamic needs to be created so that they can push back to the outside. Um, and if you want to understand what's actually happening in there, that's the way to understand it. Is that there's all this pressure from the outside to change, but there's a lot of pressure from the inside to not change. And this whole dynamic regarding the king that Cher is trying to present is really reducible ultimately to um, uh, public relations um, uh, projections from the United States State Department. That's the harsh truth of this. So um, when you run up against something like this, it's not always fair to make accusations immediately. Um, it's not clear, whether Scheer is working with um, uh, compromised information or pushing that compromised information with intent. Um, and while I am familiar with him, and I have seen quite a bit of his interviews on the Real News, I'm not willing to state whether this is an issue of media manipulation or an issue of useful idiocy. So the next report up here, and I'm finishing phase 2 of my meal here. Phase 1 was a little bit of eggs left from yesterday. Phase 2 is my smoothie, and phase 3 will be my salami sandwich. These are shorter reports, but there's lots of information in them. This one is about the question of whether Finland and NATO, Finland and Sweden, and Norway is not discussed here for different reasons, whether Finland and Sweden should join NATO. And it's again presented from a perspective that indicates some familiarity with State Department perspectives, to say the least. It did a good job of explaining why they're not in NATO in the first place, which was for me to put my own spin on this. I think to explain it properly would be that they had determined that it was in their best interests to wait to see whether the Soviets were more successful. From a cultural perspective, well, I mean, they correctly point out that the Swedes and Finns have both fought wars against the Russians. But what the report doesn't point out is that from a cultural perspective, the Swedes and Finns are closer to Russian civilization than they are to Roman civilization. And that is ultimately the reason why the idea of joining NATO is unpopular in the Scandinavian countries. They're not Roman. When we looked at the other the video a few reactions back about the European plane, and we saw how that was a good way to split Europe in half into north and south from the Roman and non-Roman areas. There was kind of a slice near the top of northern Europe that was non-Roman, but I mean that area has been assimilated, over time. Scandinavia never was a part of any Roman Empire. It has never been Romanized. It's just not Roman. So the people in the region see themselves as distinct from the Roman culture. They're not a part of Western culture in the same sense. Now, I know that's hard for people outside of, European history, or people that even in North America that are fed a specific line about North American history, but it's the reality of it. So why are they resistant to joining these Roman Empire-like institutions? Because they were never a part of it. Historically, they were more aligned with the steppe cultures. In fact, the concept of Russia that we understand it was built as a Swedish colony, right? So I mean, this may seem distant and esoteric and all these sorts of things, but it is the actual root of the reasons that that we don't see this integration. The Swedes don't really want to decide that, okay, we're going to go with Italy. The Swedes may, in the end, prefer to be a part of a Soviet or a Russian-based empire. And I mean, it's just the ultimate reality of it. Now, of course, if the Russians were in charge, if they had, the right levers and they could co-opt the, the institutions in Sweden and Finland, then this would be a non-issue because the Russians would just take over. Um, in actual fact, it's largely the other way around. The Finns were a German ally in the Second World War, which means they became an American ally in the Cold War, sort of. They managed to maintain some independence, but I mean, it's um, that's the way the Western system works. Is that they don't. I mean, the way the Russian system works is that you put in puppets and you tell them what to do, and no matter what. And at the moment they don't listen to what you say, you implode them, right? It's empire straight up, no matter what, right? The more of an quote unquote Oriental concept of empire, whereas the Romans are more to do with kind of they grant puppet state status, but they give them kind of broader levels of freedom, right? So I mean, it just from that perspective, it made more sense for them to exist in the Western sphere. And I mean, there's no question that they always have been, but they're not Romans, and so they don't want to integrate with these Roman um, ideas. Um, and that's really kind of all there is to it. Will they join NATO? I don't think so. Um, One could say the same thing about the areas around Latvia, Lithuania. Um, they're not Romans um, either, although they were maybe more Romanized during the Teutonic Knights period. But I mean, they're still. I mean, that's not Roman civilization. That's outside of it. Um, but if you actually look at what's happened, it's not unreasonable to suggest that there's currently an occupation of Latvia by NATO forces. Um, that the occupation is not particularly popular. Um, I mean, it might get kind of um, uh, above popular. It might get majority support at some point. Depending on what questions you ask and how you ask them. Although it certainly would not get majority support depending on what questions you ask and how you present them. But it's I mean it's an issue of convenience, right? Latvians don't see themselves as a part of NATO so much as they see NATO as a useful tool to protect themselves, right? It's very different than a country like France that sees itself as um, the continuation of Roman culture and the European as a cultural and historic sphere, right? So I mean, maybe it's better to put it kind of in this sort of context. Will the Baltic countries stay in NATO? They're in NATO right now. Or let's maybe present an alternate question. Rather than ask the question of will Scandinavia join NATO, maybe a more important question to ask is how long will the Baltic countries stay in NATO? Because the reality is that this is not their cultural heritage. This is not their nationalistic identity, and it's not stable in the long run. What's going to happen to this kind of areas? Um, well, what areas are Roman? Well, of course, Italy, France, and the reality is that most of what we call Germany today was Roman, um, with the northern kind of parts not. So what countries are outside of that? Well, there's Sweden and Finland. There's the Baltic countries, and there is arguably Denmark. Um, Denmark is in the middle point. Poland is also in a middle point. Um, and then as you kind of go over the areas of Austria and Hungary, that area is not really Roman either, but it's kind of almost Roman. It's kind of more like the north of Germany where it's become Roman, even though it never kind of quite was. And then you kind of go around and we see it kind of stops in Bulgaria. Romania was Roman. In fact, they speak Roman. People forget that too. There's that kind of split around, right? And the areas that are outside of it are split into kind of two categories. There's the Eastern Roman side of things, which um, uh, is basically Russia, and then there's the German side of things, which are Scandinavian countries, the Baltic countries, and Denmark. In the broad scheme of things, I actually think that you'll probably see three powers um, kind of end up constructed out of this, rather than two, and that the idea of that of a third power carving itself out is inherently intertwined with the idea of European sovereignty, and hence the better question to ask is not will Scandinavia join NATO, but will the Baltics join Scandinavia? Will Denmark join Scandinavia? Will perhaps even England um, join Scandinavia? But it would for Scandinavia to join NATO would be for um, the historic split between North and Southern Europe to finally close, and that's not likely at any point in the near future. Um, the people of the north of Europe are not Romans. They do not identify as Romans, and they don't want to be Romans. And they're not going to peacefully join forces with the Romans. That's something that will require some level of conflict. So I was musing about how um, I didn't really want an Instagram account or to be a model or to have people follow my pictures or to be a star. That kind of thing wasn't really what I signed up for. I'm Gen X. I don't, I'm opposed to all those things. Um, and I don't exactly want to say I look down on the younger people. It's just that I can't relate to them. I don't understand. Um, you know, it would be nice if people listened to what I had to say, or at least, I mean that literally, like actually listen to what I had to say, not listened and did, but listened. That would be great. It would be a nice change. It's not really the way of the world, though, is it? Um, but I mean, that's what I was looking for. It'd be nice if people listen to my music and I'm like, wow, that's a lot of fun to listen to. And I'm enjoying this instead of, it's like, you know, where's the drop? Like it would be great. Um, but that said, I am going to do an Instagram account. I feel that I have an obligation to. Um, in fact, I'm surprised that I haven't done it before, but I think I figured out why. You can't. You need a phone. um, how about that? I didn't know that you could only access Instagram from a phone because I never had the slightest bit of interest in it. It seems not the best approach unless you're spying on people, which is of course what they're doing. So the fact that you need a phone to use Instagram is pretty much proof that it's surveillance software. But whatever. What I can do is I can download an emulator. Like when I tell you I don't have a phone, I'm not joking. I'm not avoiding anything. I really honestly don't have one. I'll get one day, but I mean it'll be like an Android. It'll be like the first version of Android that came out when I finally get it. And I'll just the only time I'll ever use it is when I get like free Wi-Fi at a Tim Hortons. It's really the only scenario where I've yet to run into where I'm kind of wishing I had one is the overnight at a coffee shop scenario. Anyways, it seems like they turned the heat off again. You know, like, yeah, I turned the heat on last night. It was minus 20. Generally, when it's minus 20, you turn the heat on. Now it's warmed up, so I've turned the heat off. Um, and I'll wait for you to turn the heat back on. Um, if the pipes freeze, don't look at me. You know, I don't know why they don't just set the heat to a. See, this is their problem. The problem that they're having is that they're playing with it too much. If they just set it to a specific point, like I've done, then it would be very easy to deal with. You know, the heat comes up, and then, you know, if my heat goes up, then their heat goes off, right? You know, but they're setting their thermostats up and down, and because I'm not following a regular schedule, what's ended up happening is that my rational adjustments are um, uh, confusing their, you know, schedule based. You know, so if they set it up so that, you know, the heat goes off every night, and I'm up all night, well, then that's going to counteract it, right? Or if I go to sleep at noon and I turn the heat off because I go to sleep at noon, then, you know, and they're all confused, right? Um, the best thing they can do is just set it flat. I'm not going to be in here for the rest of the night, so I don't care if the heat comes down a little. Just let me make sure that it's at what I want it to be at. It is. And in fact, it just turned on because they turned the heat off upstairs. But whatever. um, I mean, it's -2. It's not. It's not 12. There's a big difference. But yeah, I'm gonna do an Instagram account. It's not going to be what you might expect. In fact, it's going to be pretty gross. I'm sure it'll be up by the time this vlog comes up. But I mean, it's I think I'm required to have my take on Instagram. The thing about Instagram is like the premise. I find the premise frightening. You know, the idea that I'm going to upload pictures, you know, on a regular basis, and I'm going to take some kind of pleasure in creepy people subscribing to my pictures. I don't understand who or why. I mean, number one, who would want to do that, and why they would want to do that? It does not make sense to me. Even if you're an aspiring model or something, it doesn't make sense to give your pictures away for free, does it? It's just like nonsense. Very, very hard to understand. And if you're not an aspiring model, like, what, like, are you a pervert? I mean, really, honestly, that's about the only. And you know, it's probably true. You know, what word better describes Kim Kardashian than pervert? They're perverts. It's a culture based on sexual perversion, and that's really what it's all about, right? You know, watch me put up some slimy picture of myself, and then you know, like it's, you know, and then they one up each other on their perversions. It's disgusting. Okay, and I'm sorry, but that's the actual flat analysis. Open truth is that whole culture is gross. It makes me want to vomit. So let's put up some gross pictures then. Let's put up some pictures that will truly make you really want to vomit. Recent polling for Bush seems unusually bad. This is South Carolina, and I'm not budging. But I want to point out that Trump seems to be attracting a lot of independents that may not normally involve themselves in a Republican primary. That was an ingredient of Obama's win in 2008. Bush does need to get a bounce, and pretty soon, and he needs to cut a deal with Kasich yesterday. It's inconceivable how Rubio or Cruz can win this. They're simply too right-wing. As I pointed out before, it makes Trump look moderate in comparison. That's what is happening and what everybody needs to understand. The field people are seeing is Rubio and Cruz on the right and Trump in the center, so they're picking Trump. It's insane. it can't possibly sustain itself. Americans are stupid, sure, but they're not this bad. They cannot possibly settle on Trump as the moderate or centrist Republican. It's insane. But as long as the banks keep pushing these right-wing blowhards and the field stays split, it's the only outcome. I remain convinced that Kasich and Bush are the only serious candidates, and that you can more or less forget about Cruz and Rubio. They're not serious candidates. They're too right-wing, even for primary voters. But you can't write off Trump the same way. Rather, the harder the banks were to push the right, that is Rubio and Cruz, instead of the center, that is Bush, the more Trump seems certain to win. The field is narrowed a little, but it seems like he's not getting through. If both Bush and Kasich drop, Trump will coast to the win, and landslides. Trump will blow out Rubio or Cruz head-to-head, but he'd lose to Bush. Stated tersely, it seems like the banks are really fucking this up, and Trump is really throwing a wrench in the whole thing. Hillary is Plan F, and she might not get through either. I mean, the root of the problem is not Trump. He's an idiot. He shouldn't be running circles around Goldman Sachs like this. The problem is a terrible analysis by the banks, combined with what looks like nepotism and pushing through Cruz. Now, they've got moderate split between Bush and Rubio, the right split between Rubio and Cruz, and independents and populists coming out in droves for Trump. They keep shifting directions and spinning around and falling over each other, trying to react to Trump. But it's not due to any brilliance in tactic, it's just because he's incoherent. The last time I saw something this bad was the Liberal Party of Canada try to beat Stephen Harper. They couldn't figure it out. People concluded Harper was a genius. But in truth, it was the Liberals that kept running bad candidates and taking incomprehensible positions. They finally beat him with a little of his own medicine. It's too late to find the anti-Trump. The closest thing in the spectrum is Sanders, and you're really better off floating Trump a deal than thinking you can buy it Sanders. I still think Bush is the guy, and he got what he needed to get the bounce, but now he needs to actually convert logic into votes. And if he can't, President Donald Trump. Let's say that right this time. President Donald Trump. Take a good look at that. You want to know another good example of this kind of dynamic? The Soviets versus Reagan. The American right gives Reagan credit for ending the Cold War. It's of course nonsense, but they are right in pointing out that Reagan caused the Soviets to stand down. It wasn't due to brilliant tactical choices, though. It was precisely the opposite. After decades of rational analysis, game theory, mutually assured destruction and the like, the Soviets came up against something they couldn't react to. An irrational actor. They could no longer predict behavior with any certainty, because they no longer had any faith in the inherent rationality of their opponent. And so the only rational choice was to withdraw. It was like an episode of Inspector Gadget. And given that truth, it may actually be time for Plan